Hello, my name is Filipa Samarra. I'm from the University of Iceland, and today I'm going to talk to you about 40 years of research on killer whales in Iceland and the importance of long-term studies. Killer whales have a very widespread distribution. They can be found in all of the world's oceans, but tend to be more common in temperate and polar regions, particularly in coastal waters. There are several locations where long-term studies have been conducted, but the best studied populations are those in the Northeast Pacific, where decades of continuous study have shown the existence of two very well-known, distinct ecotypes. Resident killer whales are fish specialists, feeding primarily on salmon. They form large family groups where offspring do not leave the group when they mature, and they are acoustically active during most behaviors, exhibiting group-specific call repertoires. On the other hand, transients, or Biggs killer whales, specialize on marine mammals, form small groups with dispersal, and are generally silent to avoid detection by their prey, except when after a kill or when milling. They also have a relatively small call repertoire that is shared more widely across social groups. Both ecotypes are socially and genetically segregated. So what we can see is that in killer whales, you truly are what you eat. And differences in diet are reflected in differences in many other aspects of the lives of these whales. Now in Iceland, studies began in the 1980s due to a need for population assessment for issuing of live capture permits. However, once the live captures ended, a period of mostly opportunistic data collection followed until the attempt to release Keiko, the whale from the Free Willy movies. Research at this point was conducted in South Iceland on the free-ranging whales that occurred in this area in the summertime. Once Keiko was released, the research once again was mostly opportunistic until the start of the Icelandic Orca project in 2008. This has now become the longest-running continuous and dedicated killer whale research program in Iceland. Now, in Iceland, killer whales have been known to associate with herring for decades, if not even centuries, and therefore they were initially proposed to be herring specialists. However, predation reports show that the prey that are targeted is more diverse than just herring, and this includes different species of fish and marine mammals. But it remains unknown if this is due to the presence of different ecotypes as seen in the Pacific. Now, more recently, studies combining observational data with photo identification and analysis of chemical markers from biopsy samples of known individuals show that there is indeed diversity in the feeding strategies within the population. It supported the existence of herring specialists as initially proposed, but also whales that have a mixed diet that includes both fish and marine mammals. This diversity in the diet is mirrored in diversity in pollutant loads. So in this study, PCB levels were shown to be much higher for the whales that have a mixed diet than for those that feed predominantly on herring. Males and females have differences in their PCB loads because females are able to offload some of their PCB loads to the calves through their milk. But the whales that have a mixed diet showed PCB levels that were above known risk thresholds for health effects, which shows that the individuals within the population are exposed to different threats. And really, this population cannot be viewed as a homogeneous unit that is composed of ecologically equivalent individuals. There are differences within this population, and not all individuals are the same. So how then does this diversity in diet affect other aspects of the behavior of this population? If we look at their acoustic communication, we can see that they are most vocally active during feeding, but travel in silence, which could be to avoid detection because herring has quite good hearing compared to other fish species. With observations and tagging studies, we can also see that they feed by encircling prey in a coordinated group behavior, similar to the carousel feeding that was described for Norwegian herring-eating killer whales. Vocalizing may allow then the whales to coordinate their movements during this feeding behavior to successfully feed on schooling herring. Assessing group-specific call repertoires has been more difficult because the whales are often found in large aggregations and it is difficult to isolate specific groups. An initial study in the 1980s found preliminary evidence for the presence of group-specific repertoires, but was based on very few recordings. More recently, a comparison of call types recorded in different locations around Iceland suggests some differences in call types recorded between locations, but also some sounds that are common across all areas. In this map, all the grayscale colors show sounds that are shared across some or all of the locations. However, more research aligning group recordings with photo ID will be needed to really answer this question. Assessing social structure has been very complicated by the intermittent nature of the research in Iceland, until the recent continuous efforts. It is hard to compare photo ID collected in the 1980s and 1990s with present-day data, because many individuals might have changed beyond the point of recognition. So social structure studies have only focused on short time series, but they suggest a non-hierarchical, multi-level society, with some preliminary evidence of stable groups, including limited offspring dispersal. There are indications of potential seasonal differences in social organization, and to learn more about that, I encourage you to watch the talk by Ailey O'Brien on the Wednesday afternoon Biology 2 session. In terms of abundance and connectivity, we know that this population was subjected to takes during the 20th century, which included whaling, conflicts with fisheries, and live captures. However, we have no idea what the impact of these takes really was. Abundance has been estimated only over a wide geographical area that extends from Greenland to Norway from line transect surveys. But the precision of these estimates was too low to estimate population trends. Now, due to the distribution of whaling catches, it was proposed initially that killer whales might migrate between Iceland and Norway. However, a comparison of earlier photo ID catalogs found no photographic matches. On the contrary, photographic matches were found to Scotland, showing that there is regular seasonal migration between these two locations. Call type repertoire comparisons also supported these results, with Iceland and Scotland sharing some calls in the repertoire, but no clear call type sharing with Norway. Iceland sits in the middle of the North Atlantic, and while killer whale sightings are more common in the south and in the west, which are herring grounds, they are also sighted in other regions. To learn more about where these whales are sighted, you can see the short talks of Tatiana Marchand and Anna Seldman on the Distribution and Habitat Modeling 2 session on Wednesday morning. For some individuals occurring in Iceland, their sightings are only seasonal and others are only occasionally sighted. Therefore, Iceland could be a stopover or a seasonal home for individuals that have a much wider distribution. The furthest photographic match was found recently to the Mediterranean, but this was a group that had emaciated individuals that appear to have perished, and it's not believed to be a common movement pattern. But what about connectivity to other regions in the North Atlantic? We still have really little understanding of this, and present-day photo ID and call type repertoire comparisons are needed to resolve this question. Genetically, individuals in Iceland have grouped with whales sampled in Norway, Scotland, and Greenland. In this map, from a study including stranded samples from Iceland, the colors represent different genetic populations, and it shows that at least two populations appear to be present in Iceland. A study using samples from known free-ranging whales then found low genetic differentiation within the population. But this differentiation was related to known movement patterns and diet preferences. In this graph, you can see the stable isotope signatures of carbon and nitrogen of known individuals. The individuals with the larger values of nitrogen are those that have a mixed diet, and those with the larger circles are the ones that we know travel to Scotland. These whales group genetically and seem to be different from those that feed predominantly on herring at the bottom of the graph. However, When we plot the social association among killer whales from these different genetic units, it's possible to see that there is no social segregation between whales from different units or whales that have different diets. So if we compare Icelandic killer whales with the well-known residents and Bigg's killer whales, we see that there is within population variation in feeding strategies. We see preliminary evidence of stable groups without offspring dispersal, but a less hierarchical structure. However, this is based on relatively short, continuous time series, and therefore needs further data to be confirmed. We see that acoustically, they are also somewhat in between, with vocal activity mostly related to feeding. Group-specific repertoires are possible, but common call types across the population are possible too. Unlike residents and Bigg's killer whales, we see little evidence of social or genetic segregation within this population. So despite research on killer whales having been conducted for 40 years in Iceland, the fact that it's been intermittent has meant that we are still lagging behind the knowledge that exists in other well-studied populations. This highlights the importance of continued long-term monitoring. And in Iceland, this is particularly important within herring grounds, where they are regularly seen, but also outside of these areas to better understand the variety of feeding strategies that exist. Assessing the population conservation status will rely on the estimation of population abundance, dynamics, and trends, which are currently lacking, and need to be conducted bearing in mind the within population variation that exists, and how these parameters might vary between different units within the population. As climate changes and prey availability might be affected, understanding if true herring specialists exist in this population is essential to understand the prey requirements the population may have and the consequences of future environmental changes. Understanding the connectivity across regions of the North Atlantic and how that might expose the whales to different threats is also necessary. And finally, understanding how diet influences social and acoustic behavior will allow us to better understand how this species is able to adapt to different habitats and thrive. I would like to acknowledge all the students, colleagues, and citizen scientists that have contributed to our study over the years, as well as the funders that made the project possible, and my co-author, Gisli Vikingsson. Thank you very much for listening.